Thank you all. It's great to be here and share some of the work that we're doing at the Pacific Northwest Research Station. As Claire said, my name is Cerveny, and I'm a social scientist over in the Fremont lab, which maybe you know about or don't know about, but we have a stealth team of social scientists there working on different things. I'm going to introduce the team in a minute. Some of you may or may not be aware of, I guess let me talk about what I'm going to talk about first. So I thought I'd spend a few minutes talking about Forest Service research, what we do, and the program and team that I'm a part of, and then just introduce you to some of the other team members that we have who are working on social science and related topics. Then I'll talk a little bit about social science, public involvement, and the planning process in general, which led me to work on this human ecology mapping work that I'm doing. I'll then introduce human ecology mapping and provide 3 cases where it's been used. All in the Northwest, 1 in Oregon and 2 in Washington. And then I thought we could have a discussion about what we've learned so far and some of your thoughts, questions, and reactions to what I'm sharing today. So I hope to talk for about 40 minutes or so. I'm going to try to keep track of time so that we have plenty of time for questions at the end. So Pacific Northwest Research Station, many of you may know that Forest Service, which is the agency I work for, has a research division. We have 7 research stations throughout the country, and I'm part of the Pacific Northwest Research Station, which is based in Portland, but we have 11 labs in Washington, Oregon, and Alaska. And we also have 12 experimental forests, all spread throughout the region. And we have what's called WETAC, the Western Wildland Environmental Threat Assessment Center in Prineville, Oregon. And we have a brand new Northwest Climate Hub in Corvallis. So we have a lot of different research facilities around the Northwest, and you can see them out there. I'm part of the Goods, Services, and Values program, which includes 3 teams: People and Natural Resources, which is my team; Ecosystem Services and Processes, which looks at wood utilization; and then Landscape Uses and Values, which is our team of economists. So the social scientists who are not economists tend to be on the People and Natural Resources team. And we look at a whole array of issues, as you can see from this list, looking at how social and economic processes interact with the natural environment. We look at how policies and programs affect human resource interactions. We look at how changing demographics, new technology, changes in socioeconomics affects people's relationship with the environment. We're also looking at lands and landscapes and the benefits that lands provide to people, to human wants and human needs. And then a lot of our work is to try to use interdisciplinary approaches and tools to develop science-based approaches to management. And that's kind of where this project, although it overlaps with other things, that's where this project falls. We're really trying to use scientific approaches to develop tools that managers and planners can use to make better decisions and have better outcomes. So just to give you a quick introduction to all these friendly faces, some of them crashed the holiday party this year, so you may recognize some. And these folks are all a resource for people here at the university, and so I hope that we can continue to have strengthened relations between our agencies and organizations and learn from each other. We have Dale Blana, who does a lot of work on planning at the landscape scale, looking at planning across jurisdictions. He's also doing a lot of work on stewardship, volunteering, and urban trees and urban forestry. There's me, and I'll talk about my work, so we can skip over that. Then we have Monica Darien. She's brand new to us, and she focuses on recreation planning. She's looking at outdoor experiences, human health and well-being, and she's also starting a new project on diversity and inclusion, how to get more people outdoors and ways to engage people in the outdoors. Anna Miller is our postdoc, and she's a recreation ecologist, and she's looking at different ways to integrate humans and wildlife in the landscape together. And Matt Helmer is an archaeologist looking at heritage and the interactions between heritage and recreation. So we have a pretty diverse team here in Seattle. We have other folks in Portland and Juneau and Corvallis, but I'm skipping over them because we're in Seattle later. I just like to let you know who's all locally nearby, so you can tap into. So a couple of those policy background pieces, you all probably know about the National Environmental Policy Act, which stipulates the use of the integrated use of natural and social science in the planning process, and requires that agency provide opportunities for meaningful public engagement. And we see similar kind of requirements in the National Forest Management Act, especially in the new 2012, well not so new, newish planning rule that requires the best use of available science in that planning process, and that further emphasizes the role of collaboration and public engagement to get people involved in this planning process. So this is kind of the policy context that informs some of the work that we're doing. In previous work, I worked with a team from Virginia Tech, and we did, this is back in 2010, and we did an analysis of 106 planning processes for NEPA, which looked at recreation and travel management. We interviewed 106 team leaders who were engaged on this recreation and travel management planning process, and we did a very detailed analysis of all the planning documents associated with that. And we found some interesting things. We asked the team leaders to talk about the success factors involved in these NEPA planning projects. What was successful? The best available science came in 9th place out of 18 items. So the role of science there seemed a little bit less important perhaps than some of the other process aspects of, like having a transparent process was very important, for example. Science came out pretty low. Natural science was number 9 and social science was number 12. So this kind of got me thinking about what is the role of science in some of these really important environmental planning decisions. We also did an analysis of the role of science-based planning tools in these processes. To what extent were they used? And then we interviewed folks asking them, about their knowledge of these planning tools and how they were used in the process. And we found that overwhelmingly people were aware of these planning tools, but they were very inconsistently used in these planning efforts that were quite similar involving recreation and travel management. It would have been a real natural thing for them to use the tools, but they just were very inconsistently used. However, tools that were place-based really focused on people's connection with nature and the natural environment in a particular place. They weren't used very often, but when they were used, they were highly effective. So this got me thinking about how can we improve the role of science in these processes, and how maybe can we focus on place-based approaches since they seem to be more successful. Around that same time, Claire, Ryan, and I engaged in a project where we were conducting interviews, in-depth interviews with recreation managers and scientists about the best way to use science in decision-making and looking at barriers and how science has been used. We found a number of things in our study, but a couple of things that we learned is that natural resource agencies like the Forest Service have reduced capacity over the last 20-25 years, and there just aren't a lot of people in the agency who are doing this kind of science delivery, tech transfer kind of role, that there's a tremendous need for science, and that recreation managers need science and data that's relevant, that comes exactly at the right time for their planning process, and that is at the right scale for them to do the analysis that they need to do. We also learned from that study that the recreation managers that we interviewed face some challenges in being able to read studies that have taken place in other places and then extrapolate from that to apply to where they work. So to work across settings. So those are some things that we learned from that study, among other things. But all of this got me thinking about what we need to do better. A few other challenges to mention. A study by Charlie and others found that the standards for using the best available social science in these planning processes was far inferior to the best available natural science, and that we need more work and rigor to try to figure out what social science is appropriate for planning. We also have heard that there is a lack of social science data available at the right scale. I mentioned that earlier. We've talked to managers and they say qualitative data is just really hard for us to use in planning processes. We don't know what to do with it. And a lot of social science comes to them in that form. And we've heard that the public involvement processes that are associated with these planning efforts may bring in lots of information, but these data that come in aren't systematically summarized or analyzed, and then what happens to that information is not clear. It kind of goes sometimes into a little bit of a black hole, and it's not clear how it affected the actual outcome. So these are some things that we've been hearing, and all of this has kind of led us to the point in 2011 or 12 to say we need to try something different. We need socio-cultural data layers that are spatial, that can capture social values and landscape uses on the ground, that we can then integrate with other biophysical data that could be used in these planning processes. Because we know GIS types of data layers are really highly used, whether it's topographic data, habitat data, riparian zones. All of these data are being used in planning, but we don't have the social piece. So this project, the idea was to try to get that social piece. So what is human ecology mapping? That's what I'm going to talk about for a little bit today. Human ecology mapping is a way that we can combine our need for public engagement and the need for social data to inform the planning process. And this can be done using a variety of different kinds of questions. We can look at ecosystem or landscape values and benefits. We can look at activities or resource uses, what people are actually doing on the land. We can look at special places that people might identify on the landscape and try to understand what's special about them. We can look at what landscape features people prefer to use and what conditions of the forest people want to see in these particular places that they visit. We can also use spatial approaches to understand challenges that we're facing in management. And so I'm going to provide some cases today where we talk about all of these things. So human ecology mapping is how we've captured the work that we're doing, but participatory GIS is not new. It's been done around the world in a lot of different ways. What's great about it is that it can be done in settings where there's high literacy and low literacy. It can be done in settings, you can draw maps in dirt, or you can use clay, you can use all different kinds of things that you have available to you to symbolize people's relationship with space. And I just put some pictures up here to show some of the examples that have been done around the world. There's one at the bottom with Legos, where they're using Legos to indicate the size of buildings. There's one at the top from Australia, where they're using stickers of emus and kangaroos and other creatures to show where people have seen and spotted wildlife on the landscape. There's all different ways that can do this, that this can be done, and so it makes it a very flexible process, but it hadn't been done in the United States very much in the context of public lands management. And so we wanted to see if we could bring together some of this international work to address questions here in the landscape. Another nice thing about human ecology mapping is that it's adaptive. It can be done in community workshops or public meetings. It can be done in a targeted stakeholder meeting. Maybe you want to meet with a fishing club or the Sierra Club or a specific group separately. It can be done on site. We've done these at trailheads. We've done these on the ferry. We've done these at campgrounds. We've done these right where people are doing their outdoor behaviors. We've also done these at public events, had really good luck at farmers markets and trade shows. We were last week in the project I'm working on, we were at the Sportsman Show in Yakima collecting information. And it can be done online. So I'm going to talk about examples of these things today. But before we dive into the cases, I just want to throw out there that sometimes we tend to think about human connections with nature really focusing on outdoor recreation and leisure activities. And while that is an important use for many people, there are other different kinds of interactions that we have with the landscape that are very important too. People use public lands, national forests for their income, for work, for gathering firewood, for gathering food, for cultural practices and traditions. It's a place that families connect over time through history. It's a place for people to go and learn through environmental education programs or outdoor learning. It's a place for stewardship and volunteering where people connect with nature in a different way. So I want to just throw out there to kind of open up our ideas to all the ways that people connect with nature. And our approach is really trying to capture this in the way that we're doing this mapping. So I'm going to talk about a couple of cases after I have a sip of water. And the first one is in the Olympic Peninsula. This was kind of our test case to see if we could develop something that would really work. The forest supervisor of the Olympic National Forest approached us and said, we need a better way of understanding where people are going on the forest and what they're doing. But we don't want to just look at our forests. We want to see how our forest interacts with other public lands and areas nearby. So we don't want to just have you mapping on the forest. We want to consider the whole Olympic Peninsula, which if you look at this map, and maybe you're familiar with the area, the darker green color is the Olympic National Forest. It's kind of a donut that goes around the Olympic Peninsula, and right in the middle is the national park. Other areas are the kind of beige area, those are tribal lands, and the purple are state lands. And then I think those are all the colors that we have marked. So it's a pretty unique landscape with multiple jurisdictions. And so our project was mapping across these various jurisdictions. So for this project, our goal was to test this approach out to create a social data layer that the forest could use for planning across all lands. And a really important goal of the supervisor was that need to build trust and engage communities in dialogues about what's important. So I should say this project was not for a particular planning process. There was no major decision being ready to be made that they wanted input on. It was just kind of a baseline of what do people value about this region. So we held workshops. We held 8 community-based workshops. You can see the number of people participating ranged from 10 over in Quilcene on the Hood Canal to almost 40 in Lake Quinault area on the western side of the peninsula. They were very well attended. People were very interested in what we were doing. And so we had a workshop approach to this. What we did was take maps of the Olympic Peninsula and put them on a table and cover them with a mylar type of plastic. And we asked them a series of questions, which I'll tell you about in a second. But we had groups, 4 to 6 people gathered around the table, and we deliberately separated people who came in together, spouses and groups of people who came in together. We wanted people of different backgrounds to interact with each other around the maps. So people picked different color pens, and we attached those pen colors to their worksheets so that we knew who was who for each map. The first question that we asked them is, what places on the entire Olympic Peninsula are special to you or meaningful to you? We wanted them to draw a polygon or a circle around this place, to tell us the name of the place, attach a landscape value to it, and I'll show you in the next slide what those values are. And a primary value and a secondary value, and then to tell us in their own words why this place is important to you and what you do there. So here's an example of how they filled out the form. Here's the description of the place, the name of it. The values are listed on the left. We had all these values defined, and we went over the definitions in advance, and we had those laminated and put on the table for them. And those are the values that we had them choose from. So you can see this person picked Ruby Beach. The primary value they attached to it was aesthetic, scenery. The secondary value was recreation. They described why they liked this place. They talk about the view of Destruction Island and it's close to the highway. And then we asked them what they do there. They hike, they take photographs, and they have picnics there. So we did this, they did this for several places and marked the places on the map. This is the raw data of what it looks like. We took all those pieces of mylar I mentioned and overlaid them, and then those were all digitized, so this is kind of what it all looks like. It looks like a big mess right now, but it allows us to see some patterns once we get that digitized, and we can look at the densities here of things here. So I'm not going to go through all the data. We have 80 or 89 pages of maps for you to look at, so I'm just going to highlight a couple today that I thought might be interesting, and to give you a sense of what we're doing with this. So the one on the left is the density of landscape values. So the darker purple is the place that's most densely marked in terms of value. So you can see the area near Quinault on the west side. Those were very dark and highly mapped by people who live there and others too. The map on the right shows the diversity of landscape values. So here the darker color, in this case brown, shows places that are valued for a variety of different reasons. So 12, I think it's 12, on the darkest color, 12 different values were associated with some of those places. So the density gives us appreciation for the places that people value. The diversity tells us where there might be overlapping or possibly even conflicting values associated with the place. So the land manager can then go back and ask questions about these data to figure out, well, what's happening here? Why are these values diverse here? And can pull up what those values might be. Here's a map that shows the density of recreation values. We just pulled the recreation values out to show where recreation was of high importance on the peninsula. You can see mostly on the west side of the peninsula near Forks and Lake Quinault. Then the second activity we did with them was to map the resource interactions or uses they had of the Olympic Peninsula. Here they picked activities that were important to them, and they marked 5 places on the map where they go to do this activity. So if hiking is your thing, you would go and map 5 places where you do hiking. We wanted to experiment with which worked better, mapping interactions and uses versus values. And there were some follow-up prompts for those. So Actually asking them where they go to do things gave us more specific information. When we ask people what places they value, people tend to take their pen and draw these giant circles around the whole peninsula or giant places, which is great because that says something to me that this place is really important to them, but from a management perspective, it's hard to know what to do with that information. But when you actually ask them, well, what places do you go to use or visit, you get a little bit more specific information. And so here I brought up some different examples. Recreation is on the left. So you can see a lot of those are in places along little watersheds. Hunting and trapping, you can see that the dark circles are a little bit more spacious and open. And that's possibly because people, when they're hunting, they're going over broader areas. And then finally, I give the example of fishing or shell fishing, which takes place on long watersheds. So it's not rocket science, but it's kind of interesting how these different activities have different fingerprints, if you will, on these maps. We also can look at what the communities are saying. So I just picked 3 communities. I looked at Forks, Quinault area, and North Hood Canal. The darker green are places that were marked by these communities. And it's not surprising that people tend to mark places that are closest to home. But again, when a land manager or resource planner is making a decision about what to do at a place, they might want to know how the people in Forks feel about this and what places that they might visit and how that might affect them versus people in other parts of the Olympic Peninsula. So we can compare by communities and understand their connections with place. A year after we did this study, a graduate student at Portland State decided she was really interested in this technique and wanted to study visitors. So she went out and surveyed 300 people who were visitors to the area, and we compared that with what we learned from the residents. So on the left side, you see what the residents said. On the right is the visitors. Does anybody remember from the initial map that we looked at, what's happening in the middle of the peninsula? Does anybody remember? The park. So it was kind of interesting that the visitors tend to focus on the park, and the residents are really focusing on the national forest. And that tells us, the land manager, something about the importance of national forest lands to people living in the area. That this is their niche, to really cater to resident needs. Because the visitors, they're not necessarily paying attention to the national forest to the same extent. I mentioned that one of our goals was to integrate some of the social spatial data with biophysical data. Well, just a couple of days ago, I got this map sent to me from Mike Wisdom, who is a wildlife biologist in La Grande. He's part of our research station. And he found some of my data, and he decided he wanted to see how it overlaid with his elk nutritional data. So I was pretty excited because he just did this all on his own, and this is something that I wanted to see happen. So on the left is that recreation value data that we saw before, and on the right it's elk nutritional value. Darker color is high nutritional value of those lands, and then medium and low. And so he looked at those side by side and then created this map which shows places where the recreation use or value is high and there's low nutritional value for the elk. Then he looked at places where there was high recreational value and moderate to high nutritional value for the elk, and then low recreational value, and then high value for the nutrition for the elk. And so this was interesting because it can help to show the interaction between outdoor recreation use and places that the elk need for forage and food, to see whether there might be any conflicts in places, for example, where there's high recreational value or use and strong nutritional needs for the elk. So these are some of the questions that we could start to explore and address when we're using these socio-spatial data layers. So what did we learn from the Olympic Peninsula? We did find that maps were really effective tools to bring people together in conversations around place. People with opposing views and different lifestyles and approaches were able to stand next to each other and really share their values that they had about the place. Although they might be quite different, they both realized, hey, we both love this place, maybe for different reasons. And so it's tended to break down some of the barriers you might see or the conflict that you might see in public meetings. We also learned that some people are great with maps, other people not so much. They know where they're going in their minds and they know how to drive there or get there, but if you asked where it is on the map, they may not be able to find it. But the value of doing these workshops is that we had people in the groups helping each other with wayfinding. And they might say, where's that place where so-and-so fell off the log or something like that, and the person next to them knows where that is and can help them find it. So that was an advantage of the workshop approach. We also learned that having people draw on maps was great in terms of understanding their relationship with the place, but it's really difficult to analyze. So in the next study that we did, we used a different approach. And so, we're excited. It seems like this is promising. We have some things to work out, but we're going to keep going forward with this. So I'm going to tell you about a second project that we did. This is closer to home in the Mount Baker-Snoqualmie National Forest. They had heard about the mapping work we were doing in the Olympic Peninsula, and they said, we want your help. They were doing travel management planning, which means trying to figure out what to do with their road system. So they have a system of, I think it's 400 miles of roads, and because of funding situations and capacity of the agency, they just cannot maintain all of those roads anymore. So they're going to have to make some strategic decisions about which roads to maintain and which roads to change the use of or potentially close. This is obviously a heated topic because roads are the way that we access our public lands for the most part. So if you're closing someone's favorite road, they're going to be pretty upset about it. Other national forests had engaged in this travel management planning process, which was a requirement for every forest across the country. Public engagement was not required. And so they went kind of in the back room and created these travel management plans without a lot of public input and had faced tremendous animosity, frustration, disappointment from the communities. So the Mount Baker-Snoqualmie National Forest happened to be one of the later forests that started this process. They kind of watched everybody else to see what they did and then decided to do it better. And they called us right from the beginning and said, can you help us design a public engagement process that would allow maximum public input, that would help us understand what places people value in the forest and the roads that they're using? And we said, yeah, that would be really a great opportunity. So we decided to join them in this process. What's interesting to note is that they also were kind of prompted to do public engagement because 4 or 5 major stakeholder organizations had already somewhat threatened or started the process of doing their own public engagement around this road planning process. And so the forest said, wait a minute. Instead of each of you doing your own separate public engagement efforts, why don't we all come in on this together and do a collaborative process? So I really want to mention this collaboration. From the very beginning, it was my research team and several staff members at the supervisor's office for the forest sitting down to plan this together, but we had 4 or 5 partner organizations sitting with us planning from the very beginning. They call themselves the Sustainable Roads Cadre. They started with 4, and by the end of the project, there were 45 members of the Sustainable Roads Cadre. So it was a pretty exciting process because in the end, they became They became a group that continues to function today. So that was pretty exciting from my perspective. But their roles were very significant. They helped to convene people. They helped to recruit people. They served as hosts, making cookies and breads and coffees and bringing food to the meetings. They were trained to be volunteer facilitators for the meetings. We broke up into table groups like you saw before. Each table had a facilitator, and they were all partner organizations. So it was really exciting to kind of develop a strategy and then sit back and watch all the partner groups just jump in and take this forward. So in this case, I won't go into a lot of the details because they're kind of similar to the Olympic case, but I'll just highlight a couple of things. We used a similar public meeting approach in 8 communities, from Enumclaw all the way up to Bellingham. And then we also did an online survey because people were concerned that folks who could not attend the public meetings would need a way to present or to participate in this process. We had 284 people come to these 8 workshops that were done over the course of a few months, and then we got 1,510 people participate online. So that was pretty exciting. Unfortunately, it's so fast, we didn't have time to launch a mapping component to the online piece. So we just had people identify by name the places that were important to them. It wasn't great because some people call things their own special names, and they're not necessarily a place you would recognize on a map. We also asked them the roads they used to get to those places, and sometimes we try to follow what they said, and we couldn't find the roads they were talking about. So it wasn't ideal, but it was the best we could do. But we did get great data from 1,500 people about this whole process. So that was really, really exciting. Again, we had the map destinations. This time we picked 8, have the map 8 destinations on the forest. We used dots. because of the complications I mentioned with drawing large polygons. But we had them each have their own color, so you might have red, you might have green. You put your dot on your 8 places, and then use a matching color highlighter to draw the roads that you use to get to that place. So that gives us the road component for this. I know you can't see all these places because it's too small of a screen, and I'll blow it up in a second here. But I did want to show you, this is for all the 8 public meetings, not the online information. The darker purple colors are the places that were most intensely marked by people. And this is the entire forest, all the way from the Canadian border down to Mount Rainier. And lighter blue would be the places marked less often. The roads that are red were the roads that were most often indicated by people as being highly used. I'm going to blow this up for you so that you can see it a little better, just focusing on the Darrington Ranger District, which is one district to the east of Everett. So you can see that bright purple dot there, kind of in the middle. That place was the most frequently mentioned place, destination in Darrington. I think that's the Seattle River Road I mentioned there. And then the dark red, those are the roads that were highly used by the folks who were mapping in that Darrington area. So red was high, orange, medium, yellow, low. White roads were not used at all. So this is how we analyze these data. A couple of different trends that we observed. The one on the left, the map on the left, shows the places mapped by folks who live in the zip codes in the Seattle area. The map on the right shows people who lived in the area of Darrington, so we call it the Mountain Loop area, Darrington, Granite Falls, Arlington area. We just wanted to compare a little bit by zip code. And it's interesting to see that people in the Seattle area, they go everywhere. They go north, they go central, they go south. There seems to be a big hot spot for Seattleites along I-90 corridor, which none of this is surprising if you're familiar with some of the outdoor patterns, but it is kind of interesting and important. It was a little bit of an aha that the Seattle folks are just dispersing everywhere, and so maybe their idea of the forest is a bit bigger, perhaps, than folks who are in the Mountain Loop area who tend to use and relate to their area close to home. Again, we looked at different user types. I just picked a couple of examples. Motorized recreation, which was heavily used down by Mount Rainier in the green water area. There's some designated off-road vehicle trails. Hiking was pretty much everywhere, but especially up north near Mount Baker. We also combined the workshop data and the online data to look at top destinations. So we had a list of the top 50 destinations. These are indicated by the size of the circles on this map, big circles being large, more prominent destinations. And we compared the online and the survey, the online and the workshop data in this map. So now I want to tell you how the ID team used this information. Remember that they're making a decision about roads. So destinations are important, but the roads are important too, because eventually they have to decide which roads to keep open and which roads to close. So we used a metric that we developed where we indicated, we figured out which roads were most highly used, and we figured out which roads were most often used for diverse uses, I should say. So we looked at density again and diversity, and we came up with a metric, and we decided that the roads would get a 3 high score if they were the most dense and diverse, 2 for medium, 1 for low, and 0 for roads that were not mentioned by anybody at all. So, and those were all color-coded, and we gave this map to the planning team. Interestingly, the planning team at the onset said about 30% of the roads in the network we can't afford to keep open anymore. And what we found was that 30% of the roads in the whole system were not mentioned by anybody. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that the planning team is just going to say, great, we're just going to take those roads out of the system, because a lot of roads are used for a variety of administrative functions, to access public utilities, for fire access, and a whole bunch of different reasons. So that's not the right logic there, but it is interesting, and it was important for them to realize that 30% of the roads in the whole system, nobody marked at all. And then they could also pick the roads, the red ones that we colored, and realize, okay, these are critical roads. If we decide to mess with this road, we're going to have some people who are concerned about that. So this is how we presented it to the planning team. We tried to keep it really straightforward of what they could do with it. I also wanted to mention that we had community feedback sessions the following year. We went back to 4 of the 8 communities, and we lined their walls of their community meeting rooms with maps, and we made a short presentation about our findings. And then we had them go around and look at the maps and talk to us about them. And this was a very valuable exercise because it showed them that we're serious about this, that their data is not going into a black box, and that they could actually see it. And one of the questions we asked them is, what patterns do you see in the wall? Do you see yourself in these data? Is your use, is your experience reflected in these maps? And then they could talk about that, whether it was or whether it wasn't, what we're missing. And for the most part, they said, yeah, you got it right. I think you got what you need from us. And so it was another round of trust building as well for the Forest Service to do that step. However, when the report came out, it was very unclear in the end how the ID team actually used our information. So this was something that kind of got me thinking, how can we make it so that this data is more transparent about how the data is being used? In the end, they kind of put it in an appendix, and they wrote their decision in this report about what they were doing with the roads and what their plans were, but it wasn't clear how the social data influenced that. So I still think there might be some challenges in being able to create these socio-spatial data layers and have them used in planning. There was some turnover in the planning team, so new people came in and they weren't familiar with our project. The GIS coordinator in the forest was very overwhelmed with other projects and couldn't take the data that we gave her. And so we just never felt like we were maximizing this opportunity to gather all this information. So challenges still remain in this process. So I'm just going to talk briefly about the last project that we did to try to address some of these challenges, and then we'll stop and chat about some of these things. So a couple years ago, we were asked by the Deschutes and Ochiko National Forest to help them gather socio-spatial data that they could use in their forest planning process. They were expecting to initiate the forest planning process sometime around 2017 or 2018. And they said it would be great if we could get this information so that we could use it in the forest plan. But they didn't have a lot of staff or resources to do this. They're very constrained in terms of the human capacity in that forest. So they said, we want you to do this, but we don't want to have any workshops. We can't go out there and talk to the community about this. We want to have this public engagement, but we want it to be online. All online, just nothing else but online. So we agreed to do that. We worked with Portland State University to develop an online mapping application. We had a partner organization called Discover Your Forest who led the outreach for this. And that's how we went forward with this. And I'll talk about some of the pluses and minuses of that. In addition to the online, when we first opened it up, we got quite a few responses, but then the responses dropped off pretty rapidly after the first couple of weeks. And we noticed that most of the people responding were fairly well educated, fairly high income, and people who were, maybe an advocacy orientation to the forest. They might have strong opinions about the forest. So the people who show up to the meetings. We weren't getting what they call the missing middle, people who care about the forest but don't have time to come to meetings. And we weren't getting folks who were from underserved communities coming to these meetings or participating online. So in addition to the online, later in the project we went to public events using iPads and tablets and had people using those tablets to map. It was a good experience, but it was hard to get the information that we wanted to this way. Mostly because we were outside and people were looking at tablets and they just couldn't see the tablet sometimes. So it was a little bit frustrating. But just to give you a quick sense of what we did, similar to what we've done before, we used dots. It was all online where they could drag and click dots and drop it on places. And then pop-up windows would ask them questions about why they value the place and what they do there, what their activities were, etc. So we had 542 responses with the online and combined with the actual iPad approach as well. So you can see some of the values that we asked them to look at were scenery, wildlife, fish, hunting, fishing, recreation, similar values to what we've studied before, where they would drag these on the map. I won't spend a lot of time with these maps because you've seen some of these blobs before, but I just will mention a couple of things. So the Deschutes and the Ochiko National Forest are near each other, near Bend, Oregon. They're kind of neighbors, if you will. And we also included the Crooked River grasslands in this project. So these are the density maps that we received from this exercise. We compared people in one town, Prineville, Oregon, with people from Bend, and noticed that people in Prineville tend to go to the Ochoco National Forest, and people from Bend tend to go to the Deschutes National Forest. We looked at some of the values that came up as the most prominent, and not surprisingly, scenery and recreation and solitude were the top three. We again looked at some of these values across the landscape. I just want to point out that in some cases you have values that might be in conflict found in the same places. For example, in the middle you see social and family. There's a big dot there, and that's in the same place where people valued the wild and solitude. So, it raises questions about how can people who are seeking solitude, cohabitate or visit some of the same places where social and family and recreation and fitness are all kind of gathering. So again, managers can ask questions about these and think about these in terms of their own planning. We also looked at different activities. Here, the one thing I wanted to point out is that the forest planners were interested to know that the Ochoco National Forest on the right to the east was much more widely used by people in the area for things like what they would call traditional recreation activities: hunting, fishing, gathering, and OHV. Whereas the forest near Bend, Deschutes National Forest, was primarily used for recreation activities like hiking, mountain biking, and those kinds of things. So these forests that are side by side have very different relationships to the place and serve different functions. We asked people what size groups they want to see in this project, and you'll see most people they didn't want to be alone. Well, some wanted to be alone, but most people like it when there's a few people out there. Not so many people wanted to see many people. And the last thing I wanted to share about this was about crowding. We asked people some of the management concerns that they had, and the spot that you see marked here in the dark red were places where they felt that crowding was a big problem. And crowding came up as the most important concern. Second was user conflicts. So mountain bikers being in the same trails that hikers are using, snowmobilers being on the same trail as skiers are using, that kind of thing. So we can use these maps to show where these different kinds of management concerns are happening. In this case, I'm showing about crowding, but we could create maps for user conflicts and other things too. So after we gathered all these data, we wanted to solve the problem that we had with the Mount Baker Snoqualmie project, where we weren't sure if people were using it or how they were using it. We really wanted to be helpful. So we worked with a science liaison in Portland to organize a workshop with 40 planners and resource managers from the two forests who got together with a research team. We did a presentation of some of the results, and then we broke into small groups and spent several hours in small groups talking about the data, asking questions about the data, and they were trying to think about different ways they could use the data in their planning process. So this seemed to be helpful to them because it allowed one-on-one contact with the research team and allowed them to ask questions right on site and give them some ideas for how this could be used. So that was one of our ideas that came out of our previous work that we thought would be helpful. So what did we learn from this effort? Online mapping was definitely easier to administer. It didn't take a lot of human power, but it's not really a form of engagement. People aren't really able to ask questions and hear from people and be around people and learn from each other when you're just on the computer. So maybe it's a great way to gather information, but it's less of an engagement strategy. It does allow non-local people to participate, so that was really helpful because many of the people who participated were from Portland area or from Seattle even. We learned that the workshop that we had after was a good way to get managers talking about the data, but the forest planning process was halted for funding reasons and political reasons. So our 2-year effort to gather this data, and now we've got this great data set, it's unclear when the forest is actually going to begin its planning process. So it could be that these data become outdated very quickly. So this is just sort of one of the realities that we work in when we're trying to do social science data collection for a planning process that has a moving timeline. So I just wanted to wrap up by talking about we've got a few other studies going on. We're just last year wrapped up a project in Browns Canyon National Monument, Colorado, doing human ecology mapping there with the BLM and Forest Service unit. We just finished a project in Portland. looking at, we did 3 focus groups with Latino outdoor recreation users, looking at places they visit and barriers to outdoor recreation using maps and other tools. We're starting, just last weekend, I mentioned the Sportsman Show in Yakima. We're starting a new mapping project for the Okanagan-Wenatchee National Forest, looking at what's called the Upper Yakima Basin, kind of the area north and south of I-90, around Ellensburg and Cle Elum, and over to Yakima, that area. And then finally, next month, March 15th, we are doing a mapping workshop in the mountain to look at sustainable recreation use there. So we're getting lots of interest from the forest and management units of doing this kind of planning work. And we've learned a lot about these different strategies. I've kind of summarized them as we go along, but briefly, the public meetings and workshop is great for public engagement and communication and trust building. But it's challenging in terms of its money and resources and time needed to hold workshops. The targeted group meetings, I didn't talk about those today, but those are great for non-traditional groups who don't feel comfortable coming to public meetings. We've done some targeted workshops, as I mentioned, the Latino workshops we did in Portland, and we did some in Shelton a few years ago too. The on-site intercept trailhead approach works really well for capturing the values and uses of people who are using the forest, but it's not great for people who aren't making it out to the forest. And then the online survey was great for when we wanted to get input from non-local people, but it's difficult because it's not as strong of an engagement process. And it favors people who are more comfortable with the internet and monkeying around with dropping dots and clicking on things on the internet. So it could be favoring certain types of people or socioeconomic groups. So human ecology mapping, we found it's adaptable to multiple scales. It's nice in that we can tailor to different kinds of topics. It's a great way to engage people in conversations around place. And it's giving people a confidence and capacity to be able to talk about their connections with these places. So the process factors, I think, are really strong, building trust, getting people talking. We have developed it in a way that people can implement on their own. In fact, I just found out a couple of days ago that people kind of borrowed this whole approach and did a similar mapping project on the Umatilla National Forest in Oregon. Unbeknownst to me, I had no idea that they were doing human ecology mapping there, but they basically took the same tools we were using and doing it there, which I think is great. I mean, the easier it is to use, the more people will do it and the more information gets generated. And hopefully we'll start to get more socio-spatial data layers and get better data that we can integrate with the biophysical data. But we still are dealing with some of these challenges with the planning process, with resource managers and planners not having the capacity to deal with the data once we give it to them. And in-house GIS capacity can be up and down within a particular place. So how do we get this technology transferred is one of the big questions I'm dealing with next. So I know I've gone through a lot of material and tried to pick some diverse cases of things that I'm working on and the things that we've been learning as we've been going along. And I'm excited to hear about your questions.
I'm curious about, with those group workshops, how are people finding out about those? It seems like there would also be a bias for people who are environmentally minded or already really active in their community that are actually attending the workshops, and how do you account for that bias?
Yeah, so we really tried in each case to try to get the word out to different groups, and you're absolutely right. So there's a bias towards the organized groups that already have listservs, they have meetings, they have great ways of communicating within their groups. They're often the ones that show up more often, and so we have to work extra hard to make sure groups can participate who aren't as organized, and also that's what I was talking about, the targeted stakeholder meetings. Going out to where people are is really helpful. So in the project I mentioned that's happening in the Okanagan-Wenatchee forest that we're starting up, we have we're doing a combination of approaches: workshops, targeted mapping, and online, because there are a number of communities there that just wouldn't come to a meeting, wouldn't go online, but the forest is incredibly important to them. They've agreed to have someone come and meet with them on site. So the Backcountry Horsemen, for example, are hosting the coordinator of this to come out and do the mapping with them. And there's a elk hunting group that's hosting another one, and an OHV group that's hosting. So going to where people are, I think, is another good strategy. So, and then one of the reasons why we started doing farmers markets is we wanted to be in places where we think people might be. And so that's been very successful because we get all different kinds of people at farmers markets. And so if you can just we put these big maps up and big posters and signs to try to attract their attention and find out if they can stop by for 3 minutes and talk to us about places that they value. So, yeah.
I'm curious about, when you've done this in the past, how involved the managers have been in the process before the data actually comes to them for use. Do you try to really get them involved early on, and do you find if that's the case, are they more likely to latch onto the data and use it actively?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So we had a range, in the 3 cases I mentioned, there was a range of interest in the managers in this. In the first case on the Olympic Peninsula, the supervisor was interested in it, and we were excited to try this out, but the staff, they weren't really sure what this was all about, and it was taking up some of their time. And so we felt like we were sometimes, I don't know, it's never comfortable when you feel like you're trying to do something and people are so busy that you're adding on to their burden. In the Mount Baker-Snoqualmie case, they came to us, and the forest supervisor was so behind it at the time. She came to every public meeting and and talked for 20 minutes and talked about the importance of this. And so the whole forest was behind it. And that felt like this wonderful ride on a happy boat, because everybody wanted to do this, and then they were so vested in the outcome. And then in the Deschutes case I mentioned, because of changes in personnel and timing of the planning process, they kind of lost interest in it when they realized that they weren't going to be doing planning. They moved on to something else. And so then we felt like we were kind of pulling teeth to try to get them excited about the data. And so that's why, another reason why we had that workshop I mentioned, to sit down with the planners and managers so that we could say, hey, even if we don't do forest planning, you could actually use this to do other kinds of planning that you're doing. And so then I think it was better. But it's definitely ideal when the agency is behind it and they have the capacity and time to do it. And it seems like when there's a more high stakes challenge or conflict, that's when it might happen more. So, thanks.
Hi, thank you for the seminar. Great. I'm just curious about the map that you were showing on the Olympic Peninsula. If there is any conflicts or differences between the use of the forests and reservations, private lands, and the national forest by I guess local communities or by reservations?
If there's conflict between the uses.
Right, because the reservation you have a kind of restricted access. It's not but the Native Americans, they go to the land. But people from the towns, they may be more prone to go to spread all over the national forest.
Right.
And then you have the private lands, the
Right.
warehouse and all those companies.
I had thought we would get more people mapping spots on the reservation lands and private lands. They weren't as often mentioned by folks in the communities. But one thing I did want to mention that was kind of interesting in that project was the politics of it. At the same time that we were doing the mapping, there was something called the Wild Olympics proposal. I'm not sure the official name of it, but they're trying to get a wilderness area preserved near the Lake Quinault area. And I think that spurred a lot of people to come out for this workshop, because they were trying to make a statement that this area that they want to take and create a wilderness from is a place that's used by the local people for logging and for other activities, and they don't want it taken away or taken out of that set of uses. So in terms of sort of the politics and conflict and concern, that was one of the big things that came up for us, is people concerned about lands changing their use, and they're losing a special relationship with those places that's traditional over time. We did not actually have a lot of participation in our mapping from the tribes. And so we had several tribal representatives attending, but we were hoping to have more participation. And so they said that they would like us to come back and work with each tribe separately and do a mapping activity with each tribe separately. So we're trying to get some funding to do that. But yeah, I mean, we have an article that we wrote about the politics of mapping that came out of that project, looking at, there was another incident too in the Forks area where some OHV riders wanted to set up a special designated area. And so they came to one of our workshops and really mapped heavily in a particular area for motorized use because that's what they wanted to see happen. It was kind of aspirational mapping, if you will, because I don't think it was allowed. And so it caused us to think a lot about what, how do we deal with this? Groups of people coming in together, they just come from a meeting and now they're sitting down together and they have a kind of a unified force. In one of our mapping workshops, there was someone who wasn't mapping, who was standing to the side, and people were coming to ask him where they should map things, and then going and sitting down and doing it.
Yeah, this is related in some sense to that question, but did you find going in that there were uses that you weren't asking about that you then learned iteratively that you should in future workshops?
We tried to be encompassing of everything you could think of, but that never really works. One example that comes to mind, I mentioned the study that we did in Browns Canyon National Monument in Colorado, where we had probably 30 different activities that they could use or indicate, and we didn't have one for prospecting. And we had a group of people come and say, there's no prospecting on here. And so I said, well, there's one here about gem and minerals. Maybe you could use that one. Oh, they were very excited. That is not prospecting. And I said, oh, I know. But, so anyway, that was an example where we didn't realize that area had some value for that. And so if we were going to go back and do that, we would certainly add that. And then when we wrote the report up for that project, we made a special mention of that. So, yeah.
Do you have any feel how sensitive the process is to this political manipulation, or we might just call it like gaming the system?
Yeah.
And do you have any strategies for maybe trying to assess the data that you have, or writing your materials and your workshops in a way that could explore that? I mean, I might have the hypothesis that the data's not very good because it's really just a bunch of people who have some goal in mind that are trying to use the process to get their way.
Yeah, I would love to hear other ideas about it from this group too, because we've been wrestling with that quite a bit. It has us raise questions because there can be all kinds of gaming that takes place, and in a sense, when you're sitting down to do the map, you might be gaming for your own set of interests. Maybe you're a mountain biker and you really want more access to these trails, so you might not be organized with other mountain bikers, but you're asserting your own interests into this to some extent, and then others are doing it en masse. And so, how do we accommodate? How do we open these processes up to allow maximum participation, but also recognize some of the strategies that are going on? And we just kind of found to say what we heard and saw in each of the cases, and then the folks who are making the decision can take that into account, so that they know. What do you? What are your thoughts? You had your hand
Have you
raised.
thought about, there's some work on using social media and harnessing social media posts to get a bigger sample of people who aren't actually responding to a question, but are just posting their own activity. They don't out here. Now that we have somebody here at the university working on this kind of stuff, have you done a comparison? Have you thought about doing comparisons?
No, I'm really glad you brought that up because so we're other members of my team are working with some folks here to look at social media data to find out where people are going, what they're doing, and how it matches up with actual visitor counts to see if there's a correlation. So you may be familiar with Spencer Wood and his project, and he's working with Eric White and Monica Darian and our team to do that as well. And so that's exciting, but they're still learning about that. I'm still working on this, but we've talked about kind of pulling it together to see how does, for a particular landscape, and we can do it for the Mount Baker Snoqualmie because they're doing most of their data gathering in the Mount Baker Snoqualmie National Forest, and I've got this huge data set too. So we could actually see how it matches up, whether our places are matching up with where people are actually going based on the social media data. So that might be an interesting next step to see. But could you do that? I guess you could do it, once we get those methods for social media kind of down and easy, maybe you could do that with every study that you're doing so that you're having a public process like this, inviting people to come in, recognizing that there could be some strategic mapping going on, and then compare that with some of the social media spatial data to see if we can, it's not checks and balances, but maybe create a model that would account for some of these. I think that would be an interesting approach. Yeah.
So maybe last question, and then there's time afterwards to chat. So,
Okay.
last question.
Then someone else
No,
can have
you
it,
can.
because mine's not a question, it's a statement.
A statement.
Just frame it as a question.
Perhaps as someone who works with Spencer and Dale and Monica on that, that is definitely a good way to look at getting other people who aren't going to voluntarily like go to a meeting or go and fill out a survey online to speak up in a sense, quote unquote, because you're getting a kind of passive value. But I think there you run into similar questions with a challenge of who's using this platform and how often are they.
35-year-olds.
Yeah,
Right.
I mean, it is still like really being careful about the biases that exist
Yes.
from the people who are speaking up. So figuring that question out, I think is really valuable.
At least they're differently biased.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
Combine all that.
And maybe, yeah, you're right, because that data obviously has bias too. They're not going to know where I went if they're looking at social media.
Right.
But
They
my
might know where I
kids,
go.
maybe.
Yeah.
But yeah, so every data has its own inherent bias, and the data that we're working with has that bias of people who show up. Who are the people who show up to the meeting, or who are the people who bother to follow the link to go online to fill out this 20-minute survey that, is a little bit challenging for them to do, dragging docs and filling in, it's not an easy thing to do. So they're going to be motivated. So it's already a little bit political in that sense because they're motivated to do it. But I like the idea of using the social media data, and maybe there's some other things that we can look at too, to kind of balance it out. And the resource managers making these decisions, they're aware of some of these biases too. I think being explicit and transparent about the biases will help them to make a better decision ultimately. So, but
Let's
happy to
thank
chat.
Lee, and there is some time to have a beverage and a snack. So
Thank you.
again.